Elizabeth, New Jersey, 1st Street near the waterfront. The building is still there. 113 acres of brick and iron, most of it dark, most of it collapsing from the inside. In January 2024, a 4-alarm fire tore through the complex at dawn. Over 100 firefighters from New Jersey and New York battled the blaze for hours. 2 roofs collapsed. A brick wall came down. And when the smoke cleared, what survived were the oldest sections, the parts built in the 1870s, the original bones of the empire, still standing through sheer structural stubbornness, while the newer additions burned around them. It felt like the building was trying to tell you something. For 110 years, this factory defined a city, an industry, and an era. At its peak, it employed 40,000 workers across 48 buildings and cranked out sewing machines faster than any facility in human history. By 1913, Singer controlled 90% of America's home sewing machine market. Not a majority, not a plurality, now 90%. The word Singer had become so embedded in American domestic life that people stopped saying sewing machine entirely. They just said Singer the way a later generation would say Kleenex or Xerox. Then, on December 1st, 1982, the factory doors closed for the last time. The story of how a company goes from 90% market dominance to ruins in less than 2 decades. That's what these buildings are still trying to say, if you know what to look for inside the rubble. Isaac Merritt Singer did not want to build things. He wanted to perform. Born in 1811 in Pittstown, New York, the 8th child of a German immigrant millwright, Singer left home at 12 after his parents divorced and his father remarried. He drifted through machine shops and odd jobs, but what he really wanted was the stage. For nearly 2 decades he chased it, forming his own theater troupe, the Merritt Players, touring through whatever towns would have them. It went nowhere. By his late 30s, he was broke, in debt, and had managed simultaneously to father children with multiple women across multiple cities who did not know about each other. In 1850, he's working in a Boston machine shop as a repair mechanic, not because he loves machines, but because he needs to eat. Someone brings in a broken Lero and Blodgett sewing machine. The machine is clunky, impractical, built on a flawed design that fights the fabric instead of moving with it. Most repairmen would have fixed the problem and collected the fee. Singer looks at it and decides to rebuild the whole thing from scratch. 11 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, possessed by something he couldn't have named. He emerges with a machine unlike anything before it. Straight vertical needle, horizontal table, foot pedal freeing both hands to guide the fabric, where previous machines managed 40 stitches per minute with constant jamming. Singer's runs at 900. On August 12, 1851, he secures U.S. patent number 8294. He reportedly said, at the moment of his breakthrough, "I don't give a damn for the invention. The dimes are what I am after." He had no idea how many dimes were coming. Isaac Singer invented the machine. Edward Clark turned it into a dynasty. Clark was everything Singer wasn't. Calculated, methodical. Deeply uncomfortable with Singer's personal chaos, but too commercially shrewd to walk away from the patent. When Elias Howe sued Singer for infringement in 1852 and won, demanding $25,000 upfront plus royalties on every machine sold, Clark negotiated. When the major manufacturers were bleeding each other dry in litigation, Clark organized the 1856 sewing machine combination, America's first patent pool, bringing down Singer's per-machine royalty from $25 to $5 and freeing the entire industry to scale. Then Clark did the thing that changed American retail forever. A Singer sewing machine in 1856 costs over $100. At a time when most working families earn a few $100s a year, the product works. The market is enormous, but the price keeps the machine out of reach for the exact households that would use it most. A Clark's solution: $5 down, a few dollars a month. The machine is yours. America had never seen consumer installment credit before. Singer was the first major company to offer it. Sales nearly tripled within a year. Clark went further. He marketed directly to women, not to their husbands, not to the head of household. He placed advertisements in women's magazines. He hired female demonstrators and opened showrooms where women could come in, try the machine, and understand what it could do for their daily lives. This was radical in a society that didn't consider women primary purchasing decision-makers. Clark saw something the rest of commerce was still missing. If the product lives in a woman's hands every day, speak to her. And the trade-in program, taking old machines at partial credit, then destroying them completely rather than reselling them, eliminating the used market entirely, offered $50 credit toward a new purchase. Sales rose by nearly half again in a single year. Singer didn't just sell a product. Under Clark's architecture, it invented consumer culture. In 1872, Singer purchased 32 acres on the Elizabeth, New Jersey waterfront and broke ground on something the industrial world had never attempted: a factory devoted entirely to the manufacture of a single product, built at a scale that the era had no precedent for. The location was chosen with the precision of a military operation. The Arthur Kill waterway connected directly to the Atlantic. Finished machines could be loaded onto ships and sailing to Europe, South America, Asia, without touching another port. Railroad lines ran through the site. The labor pool was a tidal wave of immigrant workers arriving daily into New York Harbor, skilled and desperate and willing. When the factory opened in 1873, it was declared the largest employer of any single establishment in the world. 6,000 workers on site that first decade. What made it genuinely revolutionary wasn't the size. It was the self-sufficiency. Singer built their own foundry to cast metal parts, their own forge, their own power plant. Coal-fired steam engines thundering 24 hours a day, burning 450 tons of coal every single week just to keep running. Their own internal railway system, tracks running through the complex, small rail cars hauling iron castings from the foundry to the machine shop, finished components to the assembly floor. The factory didn't require a supply chain. It was one. By the mid-1880s, the Elizabeth plant was producing 6,000 to 7,000 sewing machines per week. Not per month, per week. The complex that started at 32 acres swallowed land like a hungry thing, expanding to 113 acres, 48 buildings, 2.6 million square feet of manufacturing space. And when a catastrophic fire tore through part of the complex in May 1890, Singer rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible, barely missing a production beat. The factory transformed Elizabethport from a quiet waterfront community into an industrial city. From 1870 to 1900, the local population quadrupled, from under 11,000 to over 52,000. Entire neighborhoods materialized to house the workers. Bars, shops, churches, schools, all of it orbiting around the factory's rhythm, organized around the shift changes, sustained by the paychecks. The factory wasn't just a building. It was the city's heartbeat. For over a century, it kept beating. By 1913, Singer Manufacturing Company controlled 90% of the American home sewing machine market. That number is almost impossible to contextualize unless you think about what it means in practice. Walk into 10 American homes where someone sews. 9 of them have a Singer. The brand isn't merely dominant, it has become definitional. People don't say sewing machine anymore. They say Singer, the way later generations will say Kleenex or Band-Aid, words that started as trademarks and became nouns because the product was everywhere. By the 1920s, Singer operates 1,700 stores across America and 4,300 internationally. 60,000 salespeople walk streets, knock on doors, demonstrate machines in living rooms across every continent. But not just in wealthy households. In working-class homes, in farming communities, in the most remote corners of the world. Singer built a factory in Glasgow in 1867, a 1 million square foot operation in Clydebank by 1884, a plant in Podolsk, Russia in 1902. The company that started in a Boston repair shop now exports more machines than it sells domestically. America is their home. The world is their market. In 1908, Singer builds the Singer Tower in Lower Manhattan. 47 stories, 612 feet, the tallest building on Earth at the time of its completion. It's not built for function, it's built as a statement. A monument in steel and terracotta that says, "We are not going anywhere." Even into the 1950s, after 2 world wars and the Great Depression, Singer still commands 40% of the American market and operates 3,500 stores domestically. The company has survived everything the 20th century has thrown at it. It has retooled for war production twice, switched from sewing machines to artillery shells and aircraft components and back again, rebuilt, adapted, endured. The empire feels permanent. It is not. The advertisements showed elegant women in bright parlors, hands gliding across fabric, the machine a companion rather than a tool. The factory floor told a different story. Workers clocked in for 10 to 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The foundry floor was a sustained assault on the human body, deafening, scorching, filled with metal dust that settled in lungs and stayed there. Accidents were routine. Hands caught in presses, fingers taken by cutting blades, burns from molten metal. There was no workers' compensation, no meaningful health care. You got hurt. You were replaced. Before the 1910s, children as young as 10 worked those same floors. Small hands, easier to fit into tight spaces between machines. Cheap. Management didn't discuss the ethics of it because management didn't find it ethically interesting. In 1911, the pressure broke at the Clydebank factory in Scotland. It began with 12 women in the polishing department fired without warning. Within days, 10,000 workers had walked off the job in what became one of the largest strikes in Scottish history. The demands were simple. Wages that matched the workload. Singer kept increasing without corresponding pay. The company had been extracting more labor for the same money, and the workers were finished with it. Singer settled. The point had been made. Women throughout the company did the same work as men and were paid measurably less. Immigrant workers, Italian, Polish, Irish, received the worst assignments, the lowest wages, the supervisors most inclined toward cruelty. And then there was what Singer left in the ground, the water, the air. For over a century, the Elizabeth factory disposed of industrial waste directly into the Arthur Kill and Newark Bay. Heavy metals, oils, chemical runoff, foundry byproducts. The contamination built up in the sediment, in the soil, across the entire 113-acre site, in the groundwater beneath it. By the time the factory closed, the site was a toxic landscape that would take generations and hundreds of millions of dollars to begin addressing. Parts of it remain hazardous today. The machines in American living rooms were beautiful objects. The human and environmental cost of making them was buried in the mud of Newark Bay, invisible from the showrooms on Main Street. When World War I arrived in 1914, Singer pivoted its production with shocking speed. The assembly lines that had spent decades perfecting sewing machine parts were retooled to stamp 75mm artillery shells and .45 caliber pistols. The foundries that cast iron machine bases now melted metal for ordnance. Government contracts paid well, paid reliably, and kept production maxed out. Singer made a fortune from the war. When it ended in 1918, Singer flipped the switch back. The shells stopped rolling, the sewing machines returned. But the post-war market was harder. European manufacturers were rebuilding. Competition was tightening. Production became inconsistent through the 1920s, then brutal when the Depression hit in 1929. Families struggling to buy food were not buying sewing machines. Then World War II, and this time there was no partial conversion. In June 1942, the U.S. government halted all civilian production. Singer shut down domestic sewing machine manufacturing entirely and committed fully to the war effort: aircraft components, ammunition, military machinery. The Elizabeth factory employed 40,000 workers at its wartime peak, the highest number in the company's history, running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Women filled roles that had been male only months before. They welded, they operated heavy machinery, they assembled components that would end up in aircraft flying over Europe and the Pacific. In July 1945, Japan surrendered. Singer flipped the switch again. The transition back was rocky. Government contracts vanished overnight. The 40,000-person workforce collapsed. Retooling took time. Supplier relationships had to be rebuilt. By the late 1940s, the factory was producing around 10,000 sewing machines a year, a fraction of pre-war output, but functional. Singer had survived 2 wars. It had proven it could transform and survive. What it hadn't built in either peace or wartime was a genuine capacity to read what was coming next. The post-war problem arrived quietly, which made it harder to diagnose. By the early 1950s, nearly every American household that wanted a sewing machine already owned one. And because Singer had built those machines to last, solid iron frames, quality components meant to run for decades, they weren't breaking down. They weren't being replaced. The golden goose had laid its last egg in an era of its own making. The company's answer to this was no answer at all. The management did not modernize the Elizabeth factory's aging equipment, did not fund meaningful research and development, did not ask what would compel a new generation of customers to buy. The attitude, documented in contemporaneous accounts by people who worked there, was simple. We're Singer. We've always been number one. The name will carry us. Meanwhile, Japanese and German manufacturers entered the American market with lighter machines, electric models, new design features, and lower prices. These weren't inferior products. In many cases, they were better. Consumers began to choose. Then the 1960s arrived and the cultural ground shifted completely. Women were entering the workforce in record numbers. The garment industry was producing cheap, ready-made clothing at scale. A dress you could buy off the rack at a department store cost less than the fabric and time it would take to make it yourself. Home sewing was declining from necessity to hobby, and not a particularly popular one among younger generations who were buying their clothes, not making them. The company's response in the mid-1960s was to diversify: calculators, typewriters, aerospace electronics, defense contracts. By 1969, Singer had doubled its revenue to $2 billion and employed 100,000 people worldwide. On paper, it looked like transformation. Here's what the numbers obscured. Sewing machines were still the most profitable part of the business. The diversification wasn't growth. It was distraction, funded by the cash flow from the division management had stopped believing in. Competitors like Pfaff, Bernina, Brother, and Janome were doing precisely what Singer wasn't: listening to customers, adding features, competing on design. Singer was in a boardroom debating aerospace contracts, the company that invented consumer credit, that revolutionized retail itself, had stopped paying attention to what consumers wanted. That failure, compounding quietly for 2 decades, was about to become very loud. 1975. For the first time in over a century of existence, Singer Manufacturing Company posts a financial loss. The stock price tanks. Investors exit. The board, finally forced into confrontation with reality, begins making the cuts they should have made a decade earlier. Factories around the world shut down in sequence. Tens of thousands receive pink slips. Plants that hummed for generations go silent. The Elizabeth factory, the crown jewel, the original, the building that started everything in 1872, is bleeding out through the late 1970s. Production has collapsed. The 5,000-worker complex of the war years is down to under 1,000. The company has shifted to industrial sewing machines, heavy-duty equipment for garment factories, but even that market is slipping to cheaper Asian competitors. Entire buildings in the complex site empty, machinery rusting, windows broken. In February 1982, the announcement comes: Singer is closing the Elizabeth factory permanently. After 110 years of continuous operation, the workers still remaining, mechanics, machinists, assemblers, some of whom had fathers and grandfathers on those same floors, are shattered. This is not just a job loss. It's the end of something that has organized 3 generations of family life around its rhythm. On December 1st, 1982, the doors close for the last time. In 1986, the parent company does something that makes the priorities explicit. It spins off the sewing machine division entirely, washing its hands of the product that built the empire, and goes all in on aerospace and defense electronics. The sewing machine business, Isaac Singer's invention, Edward Clark's distribution machine, 130 years of manufacturing history, is handed off, sold, traded between corporate entities. By 1999, the sewing machine division files for bankruptcy. In 2006, the Singer brand passes to SVP Worldwide, a private equity holding company now owned by Platinum Equity, a firm whose CEO is better known for owning an NBA franchise than for anything involving sewing. Today, Singer sewing machines are manufactured in China and Vietnam and sold at mass retail. But not one is made in America. The brand survives. The company does not. The 2024 fire that tore through the complex burned for days. What survived was the oldest section, the 1870s construction, the part Isaac Singer's original architects built to last. The newer additions, the 20th century expansions, the buildings added during the growth decades, burned. There's a bleak poetry in that. The parts built when the company was hungry enough to be careful are the ones still standing. The parts built during the decades of dominance when survival seemed automatic didn't make it. Stand outside what remains of the Elizabeth factory today, and the question that surfaces isn't how did this happen? The record is clear enough. Singer stopped innovating when innovation was most necessary, and it diversified into industries it didn't understand while neglecting the core business that was still generating profit. It built machines designed to last so well that its own customers didn't need to buy new ones. It watched its market change, women entering the workforce, ready-made fashion transforming consumption, new competitors with better products, and kept doing what had always worked before. None of these failures were invisible. Every one of them was documented in real time by people inside the company who understood what was happening and said so. The failures weren't of information, they were of will. The institutional conviction that 90% market share and the tallest building in the world and a century of dominance constituted permanent protection. That conviction is the thing that actually failed, and it failed before any specific business decision went wrong. The Elizabeth factory now sits where it has always sat, on the waterfront where ships once loaded Singer machines for every corner of the world. Parts of it are still occupied by small industrial tenants, machine shops, warehouses, who use corners of a complex that once employed 40,000 people. The environmental contamination in the soil and groundwater won't be remediated in anyone's lifetime who worked there. Elizabethport, the town Singer built, spent decades rebuilding around the absence of its primary employer. The process was long, painful, and incomplete. It's still ongoing. Isaac Singer said he didn't give a damn about the invention, only the dimes. He got both. He died in 1875 with a $13 million fortune and 26 children and a mansion in Devon, England, never knowing what the factory bearing his name would become. What it became was this: a ruin with 4 alarm fires, contaminated ground, broken windows letting in January wind, and the oldest walls, the 1870s brick, still standing, outlasting everything built on top of them, in the decades when the company stopped needing to build things that lasted.